a part tonight we intend to record as a lesson. I mean, basically, it's about the context of ET history in terms of then how that would become empowering when we understand bliss science better, because that's what makes your aura survive parasites, among other things. So I see that Taya has joined us, and Annalisa's there. Yes, hello.
Hi, Dan. Here, let me see if I can start my video. I haven't been feeling well, so I wasn't even thinking that I was going to be able to make it. So, but yeah, I figured I could just listen in and just kind of take a back seat today. So,
sure, that's fine. That's fine. And toward the end, if you want to say a few things, you're most welcome at any point. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
Glad you're with us. Hope you're better.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if you know Geraldine, but Geraldine's also has been extensively involved in abduction experiences as well. So,
really?
Yeah, you two get to want to know each other. Yeah.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
And
nice to meet you, Madhavi and Annalisa. Pleasure to meet you.
Cool. Nice to meet you too.
It's nice to meet you.
Yes.
Cool. Nice.
And Annalisa, do you want to just say a little hello introduction a little bit, or what would you like?
Like a lot of you, I've had some experiences I haven't been able to put fully into context, glimpses and dreams. And instead of trying to remember them all, I've just gone for the sacred fire, just trying to be alive in joy. And if there's anything I can do to facilitate healing in others, then I'm here for that.
We're especially hoping that Annalisa, later in the conversation, when we're talking about someone who's personally used a discipline around bliss process as a way through the drama of the parasites and ET issues and that sort of thing. So actually, Alex, so may I suggest a little format I had in mind? Let me know, Alex, if this seems appropriate, okay? Alex, to be clear, everyone, Alex is the one who sort of had the key knowledge and friendship with so many wonderful SSP experiencers, and Alex is a wonderful central networker here. So definitely grateful to you, Alex. Thank you. And
it's just listening. That's all. I'm just networking. That's all.
You're great, Alex. You really are. Well, and so that's why I'm asking Alex if the following sounds appropriate. So here
it's open. It's open to I let it go and let her design it. It's just a free flowing. I think we all have variably the same thing in mind. Is just love and really evolving this next age we're in, and obviously we're in that paradigm right now of creating and sustaining the new Earth. It's so clear to me.
Cool. And you're knowing all these people somehow miraculously is a wonderful asset. Thank you. So, well, I mean, what I had, many of you know that for like about 30 years, I've been working to assemble a pretty detailed ET history of Earth story, most of which is at fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood. And currently the increasing information we have about the secret space program, witnessers, some of our friends here, obviously forms a lovely additional pieces of that story. And so what I had in mind this evening, if this seems appropriate, was that I prepared what might be something on the order of a half hour, 30 to 40 minutes of a core summary of some of that history with hopefully a happily ever after. So specifically, one part of that story that is the central theme of this evening is that we know that the science of bliss, which is simply the physics of how your aura becomes charged radiant, and you know that I've spent a good chunk of my life on that, brainwave physics, flameandmind.com, bliss physics, and our new professional films on Kundalini physics, goldenmean.info/Kundalini. So we have claimed in all those stories quite clearly that if you want to have an immune system, if you want to lucid dream, if you want to take memory through death, if you want to be a remote viewer, if you want to be a shaman, plasma projective, if you want to if you want to have the lecture with your teenagers about the dangers of recreational drugs, hint, holes in your aura, the end of all those conversations is basically, can you make a big aura with Bliss. That's the essentially getting a big aura then is the story to the Mori of all those things like lucid dreaming and getting immortal and surviving death. Well, the idea of tonight's conversation was to add one more check on that checklist, which says, if you want to survive and thrive in a history of thousands of years of ET parasitism, the same thing applies. Learn a Bliss discipline and get a big aura. Check. So the details of that part of the story was what I wanted to add here. And so, as I tell, I'm just going to kind of retell a little chunk of that story, and I'm happy to have some input. Absolutely. And then at the end of that story, half hour, 30 to 40 minutes, whatever, that some of the experiencers that are with us would hopefully comment and add their piece, especially perhaps Annalisa, saying, yes, I actually did discover a parasite problem. And yes, I actually did discover a solution practically. And here's how I did it, thus turning this show into a happily ever after. So that was the idea.
Nice.
Because actually, if I may comment, most of the SSP testimonials, and the number is increasing radically all the time. I was enjoying many of the new ones, and I really like Johann Fritz, but Rebecca Rose I've been listening to, and of course I love Randy Kramer and Jason Rice. But if I may comment, most of the SSP experiencer stories generally don't have much of a happily ever after. And since as a kid, I wasn't able to see the end of Lassie episodes because of no happily ever, unless it was a happily ever after. We have that prejudice. But, and one other point I'd like to make here, and then would love to invite comments later also, is, and Alex, maybe you could be the leader of something additional, Alex, which would be just supposing now that all those SSP experiencers, many of whom you know personally, got together. And, we have friends, these are multi-million-dollar lawyers who have achieved the biggest legal court penalties in history against government agencies. This is our network. So suddenly all the SSP witnessers got together, and we got multi-million-dollar lawyers and funding and maybe a GoFundMe, whatever, and said, we are going to sue the government. And, the number of SSP witnesses are now so detailed and so relevant that the government no longer has plausible deniability. Sorry, no.
Is that even a possibility, Dan? I mean, seriously, like,
yeah.
That's like a pipe dream, no offense. I mean, that's how I tell myself, I just want to know what you really, as you're saying that, like.
No, I could speak to that. If I could mention his name, he was quite an eloquent young man. His name was Kevin Trimmel. He was a young guy, maybe in his 20s, and he was involved with SSP, and they used him as an astropath and an interfacer with massive ETs on Mars and the Templars and everything. And he had recruited somebody who was involved in international law, and it's on YouTube. I have to find it. Kevin Trimmel is his name, and he's gone dark now because of everything. I guess his own process of healing. But he was a brilliant young man. I could say probably under 30.
But see, that's perfect, Alex. So if we pull those strings, we all get together. And we put that together and we say the government has lost. People said it was a tragedy that democracy almost died with Trump, however you feel about politics. But what a much more huge tragedy the day when Truman and Eisenhower decided to lie to the entire American public about losing World War II after Admiral Byrd got kicked out of the South Pole by the Nazis because they didn't know how a vortex makes gravity, Hannibal. So, this is a disaster to a schizophrenic government. And to heal that schizophrenia in government, every agency that's been part of the lie about the secret space program needs to be called to account if the US is to recover from schizophrenia. And I think maybe the time has come now that there's so many SSP witnessers out there that are ready to tell their story with details, with witnesses, with corroboration. This is a court issue. This is an issue that could take down every agency that could be proven to have been collaborative in this tragedy. All these SSP witnesses has been abused. So anyway, let's plant that seed.
Mhm. Yeah. Let me see if I could actually find that very quickly, but go ahead, please.
Yeah. So anyway, that's another possible context for this evening's conversation. So then here is the Storal to the Mori, the short thumbnail version of this ET history, specifically the parts of the ET history that lead up to our Storal to the Mori tonight, which is, can we use the human discipline of bliss, namely big plasma projective lucid dreaming aura, as a solution to ET parasites? That's where we want to end up tonight. And so the part of the ET history story that adds to that, I thought we would review. And so this is and I have a few little notes here. Okay, so, to say at the beginning, so many people have studied a part of ET history. For example, my friend Anton Parks has done a huge, amazing job historically documenting who Enki Osiris is. Enki Osiris, the Ra, and Abraham, the father of all religions, is depicted with a green face on every statue in Egypt. And Anton Parks is the first to answer why, because he looked like a frog. And guess what? The one branch of the reptilian group related to Kingu, but the entire bloodline is called Uras, as in Uruan, which essentially means ancient dragon blood, as a Draco. And there are many branches of that bloodline, and Anton Parks has worked it out. So there's one example. You've got an incredibly detailed history of who Nudimmud Enki Osiris was. By the way, his profession was cloner. And guess how they lost their soul? They were called fallen Nephilim. So this is part of this physics tonight, is how do bloodlines lose their soul? And we are going to apply that tonight to the Greys. We're going to apply it to the Pleiadians, how the Andromedans say the Pleiadian, especially the Tegatan, the whole bloodline is decaying within 800 years because of too much parthenogenesis, and 80% females and only 20% males. They got a problem. So this business of losing a soul is also another check mark for this, that if you have a path to bliss, your race doesn't lose its soul. And that's part of the Storal to the Mori of tonight. So I mentioned the Andromedans. Now, we happen to have, I met Alex Collier, who's famous for communicating with the Andromedans many years ago when I lived in Boulder, and was introduced to the Andromedan mystics, Phaseus and Morine, who are much discussed in the literature. And actually, I began to have telepathic communications, specifically with Phaseus. And I believe the Andromedan race is very advanced, as I think anyone who has studied this issue does. And most of them know that they have their triangular craft hundreds of kilometers across, often hidden behind the moon, something that Wilcox called the Blue Sphere Alliance. And he didn't know the Andromedans were blue, hello. So those Andromedans and Phaseus have commented, for example, on the issues of the Pleiadians. For example, Swaru among the Pleiadians, Gosha's channel, gives excuses for why the Tegatan Pleiadians were kicked out of the United Federation of Planets. In fact, they were part of the parasite problem. And the reason they're part of the parasite problem is they had a genetic agenda, as I found out when I lectured at Barbara Marciniak's Pleiadian compound in North Carolina, perhaps 30 years ago, when they were involved in promiscuity and had a genetic agenda, which of course they deny, but they also deny why they were kicked out of the Planetary Federation for not obeying the rules about not abusing indigenous peoples, hint, the humans. And again, their agenda was, Swaru of the Pleiadians is always saying, well, we're 5D and you're not. What she means is we have enough longitudinal coherence in our aura to be plasma projective, hint, lucid dreaming, take memory through death, etc. And our YouTube channel has over 1 million views, and one of the most popular films there is the Physics of Ascension film. It's very simple. When you have more axes of charge spin symmetry rotating, called the next dimension, that implosion phase conjugates, the transverse, the longitudinal wave, And that coherence of longitudinal EMF coherence around your body, the Ba from the Ka, the Kesjan body, the rainbow light body, the ascension body. We have many names, but not enough electrical engineering. And so the point is that so many of these extraterrestrial races are here because they need something from the genetic library here. And that's what we need to understand, because that's our trump card. And basically, the key part of that trump card is indicated by who can lucid dream, who has clairvoyance. And clairvoyance is essentially longitudinal coherence and perception, actually, which means implosive DNA, which means, actually at Montauk, that was called boson 7, which was a spectrum analysis of the DNA that indicated the onset of longitudinal coherence. So actually, boson 7, to get a little flavor of this, if you remember in the Star Wars series, when Anakin Skywalker is being checked to see if he can be a Jedi, the raising of the Jedi, remember, is the same plasma coherence that becomes plasma projective. A Jedi in Egypt has the same meaning as a Jedi temple, as a Jedi in Star Trek. It means plasma projective. And that measurement in the Star Wars series was called microchloridians in the blood, which essentially means phase coherent implosive DNA triggered by what now we know would be the physics of Bliss. Why Luke Skywalker had to go deep into nature in order to call the Force be with you. So that was an example of a Bliss discipline, actually. So there's so many themes of this in our culture. But what we wanted to do here was, now here's where I think a little piece thumbnail of that galactic history to set the context, and then the open conversation. So what all sources agree, and the Andromedan version of this story is the same as the Pleiadian version of the story, which is very similar to the Draco version of the story, which is what we call the draconian bloodline was mysteriously planted in our galactic sector probably millions of years ago. And they did have many features. They have what they call honor, and they have a great ability to survive. And on the other hand, they have issues. And I was hoping even some of the... Thank you for laughing. You're right.
Mildly, they have issues.
Well, you see, that in fact, we tried to articulate some clues to the Draco bloodline issues at that article, fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood, where our good partner, Bill Donovan, outlined as a very advanced chemist what he would speculate to be the physics of Draco blood chemistry. Specifically, we believe they have a lipid oil-dominated blood, and they breathe in nitrogen, out cyanogen, a more carbon bone structure, and a more silicon-based nervous structure, resulting in higher frequency EEG, meaning more telepathy, but dramatically less empathy, actually, because if you don't have low frequencies in your EEG, you can't feel bigger things like ley lines, etc. So there's very specific critical issues, but it also explains why the Draco have always wanted low oxygen on planets, because oxygen and moisture is effectively a poison to them. That's kind of the physics of the Dune story. They prefer deserts. And incidentally, and their home stars, we believe, preferred low radioactivity in the environment because it's essentially a stimulant to them. And so on all of the planets they've conquered, you can tell if they're winning, radioactivity is going up and moisture is going down. It's called Dune. And but to understand the context of that is to understand their blood chemistry, and even their breathing in nitrogen and out cyanogen, the dragon breath, relates to later in the Bible when they're talking about the plague of Azoth, Azoth meaning nitrogen. It not only meant the radioactivity poisoning, which is part of the Ark of the Covenant story, because it was a container for radioactive materials, which the Draco Anunnaki were forced to use to nuke their way through the Van Allen belts because they were lousy navigators. And they needed a container for their nukes, which is the Ark of the Covenant, a Syrian device. And so the radioactive poisoning was similarly called Plague of Azoth. and we know the physics of why implosive capacitance, namely the Ark of the Covenant, would non-destructively contain radioactive materials, for example. So there's lots of pieces of this story, but the part of the story that relates hopefully to tonight's conversation is when the Draco approached the Lyran-Vegan constellations with millions of humanoids across a large swath of planets. And there was a misunderstanding in the early negotiations, and the Draco decided to nuke the place. And many millions of humans died, and there was a huge humanoid diaspora. And at that point, the rest of the galaxy spent thousands or perhaps millions of years, a long time, gathering their forces to survive against the Draco. Basically, this is the story of the galactic sector. This are called the Orion Wars. More on this at goldenmean.info/Orion. However, at a certain point, the humanoids, which were the dominant species of a big portion of the galactic sector, we're told now by the Andromedans that there are tens of thousands of humanoids, planetoids in this galactic sector alone. And at some point, the humanoids gained some advantage. So now this is where, having worked with many indigenous peoples telling their ancient Star Wars history story, I knew the Hopi, I knew the Iroquois, I knew many of the Cherokee. The Cherokee have a name for the Ophanim, the angelic forces that John Dee worked with. They have a name for them, actually. They call them the Adawi. And so, again, I knew many of the indigenous sources on this personally, as well as many of the direct sources. And so when they, very few people have put these big pieces of the puzzle together, and this is where we can suddenly chink in a huge another piece. Now we know what was happening when Enki and Lil ancestors were fleeing the Pleiades. See, this plugs in the history of Enki Osiris to this bigger picture of the Orion Wars. We actually can fit this into context. And that's the point of telling this now, is humans on Earth need a flavor of the big picture. So now we can plug in the chunk, for example, that Anton Parks, and you can read about it easily at fractalfield.com/Zeitlin, Zeitlin, where Jerry Zeitlin told Anton Parks' detailed, most exhaustive history of Enki's story. And so Enki wakes up in a cloning cooking pot with his father, Anu, in the Pleiades. And why did they have to flee to Earth? And who chased them? And why, when they set up every religion on the planet Earth, did it begin with fear of women? The Pleiades was female dominated. And this is where you can plug the Swaru story and the Pleiadian story into the Enki story with the history of Earth, every religion on the planet starting with fear of Earth, and most every religion on Earth starting with Abraham, Ab-Ra, from Ra means from Enki. Enki was a bit of a trickster. He's not totally a hero, but he was very proud of his genetic engineering, which is at that time called Nudimud, the cloner. And he's complained constantly to his Draco employers, who were paying him to clone the humans, Adam and Eve, as it were. His complaint was, well, you're only using my clones for slaves and snack food. And he had an artistic sense about him and thought, no, this could be the vaccine for the Orion Wars. Suddenly we could evolve what effectively would be a soul here. And this is where I want to add a new piece of the puzzle, because if you read between the lines, in the Sumerian, this is where we get into, do we really understand the importance of the lucid dreamers again and again and again? So when the Sumerian account of who was Noah in the Sumerian, who is named Ziusudra, I've actually made notes here. Now, Ziusudra is being informed, just like Noah, that if you want to survive, you need to know about this year flood. And, the rest of Enki's Draco family is saying, don't you tell those damn humans about the upcoming flood, which was caused by a well-known near pass of an asteroid, which had a gravitational pull effect. Don't you tell these damn humans, because there's too many of them. And the sound of them copulating at night is disturbing our sleep. But Enki's excuse for being able to tell Noah, who is the Asudra, and this is the excuse, it's very interesting. It's because as if from behind a transparent screen, he was able to inform Noah, who is the Asudra, in a lucid dream. And the fact that Noah was a lucid dreamer was the reason they survived the flood. Again and again. Now, look at Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is saying, well, you know, the Drakers have informed my ancestors that if you don't have a certain percentage of Draco blood, you're not entitled to gold powder, and therefore you can't become immortal. And one day Gilgamesh says, I'm going to show you, and he gets to be a lucid dreamer, and he penetrates the longitudinal plasma into the array of the ancestral memory of what is effectively the Dracos, and he gets to be immortal anyway, even though he didn't have a high enough percentage of Draco blood to qualify for gold powder food. So again and again, oh yes, if you understand the role of Osiris in Egypt, which is Osiris's family bloodline called Thoth, Moses. Moses means sons of Thoth, sons of Tehuti. Tehuti means Tehute, which was later translated DWD, TWT, Tehuti. DVD means the line of David, literally. So the bloodline of Thoth is the bloodline of the Egyptian royal family by name. And anyway, so the pharaohs in that bloodline were fired, of course, if you couldn't bring the rain. If you couldn't make the Nile flood on time, you don't have a job. And every pharaoh knew that for several thousand years. And that's why Tutankhamun, the blood, became a rainmaker. And that's why I teach rainmaking, goldenmean.info/rain, because I have a little fragment of that soul memory. Anywho, point being that Osiris' ability to lucid dream and literally become Atun, meaning sun god, and every religion on the planet, any scholar knows, is called a sun god religion, because if your plasma is not big enough to inhabit the sun, then you didn't grow up and you're boring. So point is, again and again and again, it's the lucid dreamers who not only just survive history, but thrive. Now, remember now, I'm speaking as an electrical engineer who designed Therify.net, which is plasma working for rejuvenation in 25 countries, and is a known and documented lucid dreaming trigger. So I'm speaking to you as an electrical engineer who's designed an electric field that replicably triggers lucid dreaming. So we believe we know what that is. That is having a longitudinally coherent charge envelope around your aura that is plasma projective. And we know that the nodes, for example, that enable Therify.net to so replicably achieve healing at a distance, that the longitudinal array looks like this, because, which is the dodecacosa, earth grid, DNA, and zodiac, because that's how longitudinal waves, the node compressional place is called sacred sites, which is measurably fractal air and reduced radioactivity, where remote viewing and astral projection is possible, is because the vortex at those compression nodes interchange the longitudinal compression points with the resulting transverse EMF component, resynthesizing heat at a distance. The physics of all action at a distance in physics, which Einstein called spooky specifically, he didn't know that longitudinal waves are gravity waves and are the physics of action at a distance. So we replicably, I mean, we had hundreds of people with Therify.net and Quantify reporting healing at a distance. And every single one of them, we tell them it's not a mystery. Here's the physics. Do it at sunrise and sunset. Do it on a ley line. Do it at a longitudinal node, and it works better. The physics of way Agnihotra works, because the four-wave mixing is what enables the longitudinal coherence. So when the Greys later, now here we're going to wrap up the history story quickly here. Obviously, and this is where the SSP experiencers come in here, is we believe the Greys, who negotiated in bad faith with Eisenhower and Truman, I suppose, after they lied about losing the war to the Nazis, and they agreed to accept some abductions. And later we know that this abduction program of the Greys, which actually we learned later the Greys were doing this by contract for pay by many of the Dracos, and they have excuses for this. It's quite a long story. And by the way, they hate being called the Greys, and well, they should. But they, if you check the documentation, it appears that at least 90% of those abducted after the Greada Treaty were lucid dreamers. And we think a high percentage of them had indigenous blood. And there's good physics here, because if your ancestors walked the same sacred magnetic lines for 1,000 years, your DNA became more fractal to the land, which is the leverage which enables lucid dreaming, what the Aboriginals call the Abraxas point physics. Why the indigenous women never leave their place of birth, because that's what gives them leverage on the grid, the song line, so to speak. So again and again, we come back to, for thousands of years, the humans were slaves and snack food. And if you don't want to be slaves and snack food anymore, your options are, when the parasites are flying over, deciding which human looks like lunch, actually, if they see you have a big aura, they might think, oh, this human might be useful. What a shock. And what this is where we enter into their world. Remember, when a Draco Orion Queen Mog chooses to do a mind meld, it feels like a vice-like grip. This is a classic, actually, and even John D. and Kelly, I had a fraction of that soul memory, perhaps, when the Ophanim said, you didn't do your homework learning this plasma symmetry alphabet, Ophanim Enochian angel language last night, and suddenly they felt this vice-like grip. And the next thing they knew that whole Ophanim Enochian alphabet, which is how they made the movie Stargate, incidentally. That's the physics, because it's the plasma symmetry of hypercube to implode, which is what a Stargate is. And by the way, that's why we could do a bit of a service here, because all these SSP experiencers are reporting using these Stargates, and not one of them has a clue to the physics when it's actually not complicated. Basically, you make something like phase conjugate plasma more broad spectral and much higher power. The same physics that creates a lucid dream is a Stargate. Even Jodie Foster knew that in the dodecahedron of contact. So each time those same Draco and Gray were selecting the humans to be abducted for the secret space program, almost all the SSP experiencers, and this is where we open this up to be much more open conversation, almost every one of those SSP experiencers said, what were they tested for? Who is psychic? Who's a lucid dreamer? Who's psychokinetic? Who's got a phase coherent aura? Who has access to bliss? Who has access to clairvoyance? That is the indicator of who was valuable to the parasites. But guess what? It also is the indicator of those who can overcome the parasites. And I recall very well my conversations with, I think it was Michael Ash, the chief time empath at Montauk, after we did the reports with Marcia Andriola and the hypnotizers who were deconditioning the Montauk experiencers. And he was telling this time when he took this, he took on the chief Draco who was running Montauk, named Charlie. And does somebody else know part of that story? So he decided that he was going to actually use the vice-like grip of his own mind power. Now, for those here who know what the physics of consciousness is, unlike Gary Schwartz and all the people who claim to be studying it, the physics of consciousness is actually very, very, very simple. It is a plasma vortex that's centripetal, and you can measure consciousness very simply. Bill Tiller in Conscious Acts of Creation measured 10 different ways that focused human attention causes electric fields to compress. Therefore, the electrical engineering measurement of how conscious you are is very simple. It's how centripetal you are, the vice-like grip. You get it? And so this ability to take on this centripetal power, which literally is when your aura becomes implosive. And that is the physics of bliss. It's that phase conjugate implosion through the Planck 0 point. That is the physics of bliss process as measurable in the flameinmind.com brainwaves. So the history of consciousness, the history of evolution, it requires that we get on board, which is learn this science of charge implosion, this plasma vortex that makes consciousness possible. I often tell the story that the medical doctors who are now repeatedly documenting that they have left their body during death experiences, I'm talking advanced high-end medical surgeons who left their body during death experiences and went outside their body to watch a surgeon cutting a hole in their skull, and they report where in the room from which they were looking at their body from outside their body. We understand all that physics, which is the same as the physics of where a ghost goes in the room to be delivered up as a ghost, which is the place of sacred space, the place of implosive charge compression, the place where vision is possible. So the same simple centripetal vortex physics of consciousness is literally, and I do mean literally, the clue to power. And the thing that's pretty cool here is obviously what makes that vortex work is pure intention, that if you have this feeling in your heart of being the perfectly shareable wave, which is why pure intention is measurable in the EKG, it's a lie detector, realheartcoherence.com. So the implosion increases when compassion increases. Compassion is also perfect compression. So you see how these things fit together so beautifully. So anyway, so I'm nearing the end of my story. And the idea of where to go from here was to say that if some of the SSP experiencers see a piece of the puzzle where it helps to fit more of the pieces together, that makes this even more compelling and also perhaps motivates our SSP experiencers to band together and create critical mass and change the schizophrenia of government that no longer has plausible deniability. And to begin that, I wonder if Annalisa, if you would like to, before we get distracted, so when we were having a little bit of this conversation some time back, Annalisa was there and she was smiling and cheering, which I thought was wonderful. And it was obvious that she had in fact discovered something about this Bliss practice as a way out for her own experience here. And I thought that'd be a wonderful, empowering message to add as a personal example, if you would like, Annalisa. Oh, Annalisa, would you unmute yourself?
Yes.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I, like many of the experiencers, started out with a fractured mind, repeatedly sexually violated at 3, and again at 11 and again at, 20 with the guys with robes and all of the creepy stuff. So I had to go beyond the mind. I couldn't heal the mind. But what I found is through the soul, there's a whole greater self. And I was on mushrooms when I found myself as a whole breath organism. And there's a simple exercise we can all do very, very quickly. Whenever you're crying, whenever you're miserable, it's because there's that feeling of brokenness. I'm broken, I'm fragmented, something is wrong. And the universal symbol for wholeness is a circle, is a sphere. So if, in the middle of one of these sobbing or fear attacks, if you'll visualize just a circle, just a sphere, with me, I instantly stop crying. It's like, oh, wholeness. So in this experience on mushrooms, I went into what I was told was a whole breath. I became a whole breath organism. And I experienced myself as the sphere around the body, and my heart center as like a nucleus. And on the in-breath, I would breathe all the energy from the sphere into the core, into that nucleus. And on the out-breath, the energy would come from source, from God, from that center part of me, and out. And just every breath, I was breathing in as a whole being. And when we practice this, we can regain our wholeness. But the primary part of this is divining the mind. It's shifting our station of identity from the mind, from the isolated human, to the whole greater self. It's like, yes, I'm the person who had all of these experiences and all of these dimensions, And, some of them I don't remember. I just have really bad feelings. And we've identified with the experience instead of with the whole greater self. So we actually need to divine the mind by shifting the identity. And we do that by repeatedly practicing our wholeness, going into the visual of the whole sphere and going into the breath. So we practice it. And in the breathing, we call in the other parts of ourselves. The entities, the attachments, they can only be there when you're not there. If you call in yourself, there's no place for them to be. You occupy yourself. There's no room for them. So instead of worrying about getting rid of them, just call yourself in. So the exercise I would like to do today, do you just want to do it now?
Sure.
Or okay. We use our imagination. We know that we create our imagination as our God screen, our field. So we're going to use our imagination to go into experience ourselves as energy beings, not as 3 density beings, but as multidimensional beings, as energy. And from this place, we can do soul retrieval in seconds. Seconds, we can get our parts back. So this is an exercise I'd like to do with everybody. So if you will, and I know that everyone here is, the reason we were experiencing this is because we're so sensitive and so we're so capable. So all we have to do is think the thoughts. I am energy. And I do use tones, and the tones just help to stabilize the field, to bring in that level of consciousness. I am energy. My body is energy. And just keep thinking those thoughts like a mantra. And if you will, give your love to source, and 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 the core of your own being, igniting this sacred fire and letting it become like a bonfire, like a pulsar star, brilliant light. The more we give love to source inside of us, it's going to turn around and boomerang and come out 100-fold, 1,000-fold. And this is where the bliss starts. I give my love to source. I give my love to source. I give my love to source.
Thank you so much, Annalisa. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Blessings. Yes.
The more we practice it, the stronger it gets.
Ah, it's wonderful. And this is what ancestors called the Great Spirit. Even Ananda Marga people talk about that central universal intelligence. Every tradition has a word for this. But basically, you're identifying with the whole. It's very true. Identify, literally. And it's true that even in the SSP stories, the moment of parasitism always begins with them attempting to fractionate the personality with trauma. And as soon as they break it apart, that's when you lose power. So pulling it together, it's like pull yourself together. well, great.
Identity, and shift the identity.
Yes, identify.
Give up the story. I experienced it. It's valid. It's all true. And it's not who I am. It's what I went through, but it's not who I am. I am this light.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And you pull yourself together when you realize that, and then your whole self is there. And as we say, the physics is if there is the implosion of bliss at the center of fire, the nature of that electrical implosion is such that waves that survive passing through the implosive center are ultimately sorted into phase called negentropy. And that means only pure intention survives. That's why anything that's parasitic, whether it's an astral parasite, a stomach parasite, or an ET parasite, if there's enough flame of bliss there, it's toast. That's the sort of physics of that story.
And the practice does go further. We send that light to the cells and connect the cells to the sun stars so that we feel the oneness with all life in the body. It really becomes, really more juicy. There are layers to that. It goes on.
Ah, wonderful. And Annalise, there's a place where people could study more of your story and instruction and suggestion there?
Right now, my website's not up. It's being redone, but you can find me on Facebook, Annalisa Litton, and my email's annalisalitton@gmail.com.
Well, good. I'd like to offer to help you share that story and that instruction. I think it's fabulous.
Thank you. Thank you.
Blessings. And so anyone else now, Alexandra, what do you think? Open comment, conversation, comments?
There's a lot of powerhouses here. I want to also welcome Marina. Marina is also one of the third wave indigos, probably a third or fourth wave beautiful indigo angelic soul. And I would love to hear from you also, Geraldine.
Please.
Or any, and also we have Vika Chanel. I'm not sure who you are, but welcome.
Vikashini, that's Valerie.
Oh, okay. But Geraldine, I'd love to hear from you and some of what you do and how we can support you in your effort, because this is also very supportive to me as the masculine, bringing back the true masculine in this essence, not from the Piscean age, mired in war and destruction, who I could hear the millions of men killed in, I hear them. Millions of men killed in the last thousands of years of war. I could hear them sending them back through the sun. And for me, it's more being the sacred container of the masculine to embrace. To me, it's a lot of the feminine that's coming through now to really bring things back into balance and trusting the great mother's energy in a sense, and doing it with Dan's great brilliance. We all need each other. We all have a piece of the pie here. So Geraldine, please, whatever you have to offer or whatever you need support in, or your story, whatever you want to share, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm very, very grateful for being here. I listening carefully to what Dan was saying earlier about, the physics of this transformation, of this creation energy that becomes alive when you understand the physics of the body. Really, I've experienced it so profoundly in this way that you mentioned. When I first had my first contact experience, I had been meditating up to 8 hours a day, and it created this incredible state of bliss and really growing this understanding of what my auric field was and what I was creating. And I think that's when I had the contact experience where I was completely vividly conscious and aware, when I was taken and introduced to hybrid children, some language, these experiences that were just mind-blowing, that shattered my reality, because at that point I was not aware of the ET presence until that happened at that level, where you can feel that experience physically. But one of the things that after that contact experience allowed me to have the ability to see the multidimensional body, and that's when my studies really went deep into looking at what this machine, this technology of the physical body is. And I began to notice that we can create these levels of high vibration, of bliss, as you call it, by working with the energy centers that are in the body, that are very much interconnected and enmeshed with our environment, that are actually projecting and creating what we're experiencing and make us a vibrational match to everything that we're going to be experiencing. And through that understanding of the body, I was able to break these contractual, I call them experiential agreements, with these darker entities, these darker ETs. And it really took me into this deep dive into really firsthand noticing that when I come into my highest expression, really, truly, very awake, it's like you come online, all these beings become aware of you, including this terrestrial government also becomes very interested in your abilities and your psychic abilities and information that you're able to channel in. And I became a clear slate in which began to channel this information about the universe, this history of these ETs and everything. So it was very interesting to discover this information as Dan has done it through physics and through studying the history. But what I discovered was that we can reach that information through our meditation, through our own work, through our own self-discovery. The information is there. It's literally encoded in our DNA, I believe. And it's if we understand the mechanism of this body and how to bring the body into that bliss state by working with the energy centers, we can reach those levels and detach and reintegrate the fragments of ourselves that are created from this trauma. and begin to shift. Now, a question that I have for Dan, and I'd love to see what you think about this, is in your opinion, looking at hybrids and how they're made, I believe that the soul, in a sense, is fragmented from that trauma, but the soul is also utilized as a core essence to create this other being, this other hybrid, which then is interdimensional. It also has the ability, because it's a cocktail of genetics, that cocktail of genetics make it available to interact and communicate and have contact with the star origins of its lineage, of its bloodline. I found that there were three main bloodlines that seeded life on Earth, on this planet, and the Draconian being one of the oldest. What I have seen is that many of the other ET races have descended from that one Draconian bloodline into the human race, which is what we are right now. And in a sense, it's this incredible fragmentation that goes from one level to another, to down to the molecular level. We're experiencing this kind of fragmentation of sorts, where it's like this spectrum where things become organized into a certain categories of information. One, I call them archetypes for different kinds of ET beings, but also we have archetypes within humans that manifest here. Do you see that these hybrids are, in your opinion, do you think that they're created to progress our human race, or do you think that it's to prolong the attachment to this three-dimensional experience in which they are feeding and, living off these human beings?
Well, I really enjoy hearing about your experience. I like your perspective. And, even Johann Fritz was describing when what they call the fractionated alters, segments of their personality have been split off and employed elsewhere. It's like a piece of a soul group. But then when the clone or the alter effectively dies or dissipates, if there is a reunion with the core soul where it started, they can actually refuse that experience and bring it into the soul group. There's a famous book called Education of Oversoul 7 by Seth Jane Roberts, how fractions of the soul, soul presence can exist in, 7 different incarnations at different times at once, and how that there is a common thread that ultimately has the potential to refuse. An example would be in William Buehler's advanced Templar studies called The Repair of the Fabric of Time. They said that, Montauk caused more grays and parasites to enter the earth because it fractionated what they call the timelines. And we now know that time is simply charge rotations. And when charge rotations restore fractality, then compression is restored and centripetal force and oneness. So the recurrent metaphor here is literally, how does one pull oneself together? In this case, a soul group. Now we know for sure the grays, particularly the ones from Reticulum, and I knew Oliver Wendell Stevens, who wrote that book, Contact from Reticulum, they were subjected to parasitism by Dracos, millennia before humans. And they're an example of a race that lost most of what we would call soul. There's many branches, and there's some very advanced ones still, the Zetas. But most of them still have this parasitic problem that effectively they would be what you call fallen, in that they can't lucid dream. You wouldn't be what you call 5D. And they're here, one of the big reasons is because there's pieces of the genetic library here that they're hoping can put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And what Humpty Dumpty is, literally, the Dracos manipulated the royal families of Europe exactly like we do show dogs for millennia. And what were they trying to cook up? Humpty Dumpty's egg. How do you make a kid who can have a soul after millennia of having lost that? And that all the king's horses couldn't put that egg back together again. Well, the physics of how you make a soul, that's the real mystery. The Pleiadians claim to be very advanced, but depending on parthenogenesis means, and 80% women means, another Andromedans say their gene pool's falling apart. Sorry. The Greys, sorry. Who knows how to make a soul? That's the Humpty Dumpty story. And we know that millennia of cloning, remember when the Dracos came here, the only method of replication that was legal was cloning. And that's by definition a way to lose your soul. And they called them fallen. So the physics of how orgasm restores the implosive braiding in DNA that we call soul, that coherent longitudinal envelope, actually means, you know, all these ways of artificial insemination and of cesarean birth, all these things weaken the soul because they weaken that implosion. So anything that serves the reunion of ancestral memory into a fusion bliss experience, that's how soul is maintained. Exactly. So,
Dan, could I just ask?
Agreed.
Can I just ask you, Geraldine, just one moment, if I could, just without deterring too much from your question, and getting back to you, Geraldine. Dan, could you speak a little bit about the Time Lords and the fabric of time and the repair of the fabric of time you had mentioned in some of your earlier lectures? I'm curious. I think it was related to the Templar.
Yes. Yeah. Well, it's the William Buehler Advanced Templar Material, all at goldenmean.info/Buehler, Buehler. They called it the repair of fabric of time. They even discussed the fact that Montauk fractionated the timeline, and that allowed more parasites, more grays to come in here. But see, what most physicists, including Einstein, really don't understand what time is. It isn't fabric. It's really quite simple. Time is simply the rate of rotation. It's very simple. It's not even complicated. So the reason time speeds up when you accelerate is because rotation speeds up. Hello? It isn't complicated. It's simple. So when we talk about the fabric of time, if the rotations enter a fabric of an array, which is fractal, an example of that very simple physics, goldenmean.info/coincidence. The physics of coincidence is simple. You look at the fabric of time and you see golden ratio times Planck in time. And so if you rearrange events on that timeline, you create coincidence, because that is fractal charge coupling. That's what coincidence is.
Does that speak to the Time Lords, Dan?
Well, yes. So to inhabit the fabric of time, remember, you inhabit an array that's called your synapses, the Indra's net. That's an array. And the reason you inhabit the array is the synapses are a fractal array, but the consciousness is the plasma tornado that inhabits the array. It's not the array itself. The consciousness is the plasma tornado that creates an eyeball. That's what consciousness is. And so if the array serves charge implosion, the array becomes self-aware. And that's true in time.
Easy.
So
The
then,
part
I'm sorry, Annalisa, go ahead.
I was going to say, part of the identity thing I do is to have people I acknowledge who I am beyond my earth plane experience. I acknowledge who I am beyond time. I acknowledge who I am in the eternal realm. And then we get so much more of our soul presence back. And we don't feel that constraint of time, of the constraint of the 3D, just by thinking those thoughts, because our minds are creating.
Well,
So we just have thoughts that open space, that open time for us.
Yes, and ultimately that becomes fractal too. So you can heal your ancestors better if you understand the fractality of that array, the self-similarity, et cetera, the spin embeddability. The sexy word in physics now is called entanglement, but entanglement is the name for phase conjugation, basically. So to inhabit the fabric of time, that's what a Time Lord is. Geraldine, you wanted to say something more?
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to ask, I mean, we have such an incredible panel of people here, and I mean, we kind of are on the same wavelength of understanding these very, very complex and also simple topics. It's just so much information. But the thing is, what can we do? In my opinion, the best way to move forward is by educating the individual to understand these things in a way where he can start working in themselves and reintegrate the fragments of them soul to begin to expand their aura and come into this bliss energy, right? This creation, the true human.
Exactly.
What is it going to take to do that? How can we do that, on a massive scale?
We must. We must.
You know, we have the physics, if I may say. We can spectrum analyze your EEG and absolutely inform you when you have bliss. We're very good at it, flameandmind.com. But now that isn't the same as causing you to have bliss. No, I cannot cause you to have bliss. The psychology you described is better than me in that regard, but I can absolutely measure when you achieve it, I'm sure. That's why it's called flameandmind.com. But once you understand the physics, that's a very good clue to the psychology, which is basically, you know, at the center lies a shareable wave, which is exactly what Annalisa and everyone here is saying, you know, and identifying with that perfectly shareable wave, you know, that's the Christos, the seed. There's a word for that in every tradition. But once we have a clue to the physics, and by the way, that has to do with Planck and the key signature and the origin of big entropy, you know, there's a lot more clues there. So now the physics fits the metaphysics better.
If I could say something, I'm gonna try and give you guys actually a picture of my face here.
Come out of the darkness, come forward, Lady Tia.
Okay, so just as a, just as an SSP quote unquote experiencer, and it's a complicated thing going through this process. I have like a whole lot of memories, and it's very hard because, well, it's a cycle. I mean, there's a beginning and an end, and it keeps repeating, and you have to get good at having traumatic experiences or traumatic memories, and then finding your center and your core again, and tapping into that bliss, and having a method for knowing yourself, knowing what creates that bliss within you, knowing what really your passion is, I guess, the things that make you you, the things that you love, the things that bring you back to, well, to who you are, but connect you to life, right? And just in my personal observations in dealing with SSP experiencers, I find that a lot of people don't actually have very many memories, at least in comparison to me. I don't really tell if they are engaged in the process, at least the process that I go through. I don't think they are going through anything similar. It's more of a natural occurrence where they were perhaps quote unquote lucky, if you want to call it that. But I mean, most people, I mean, they don't get a lot of details, you know. I was surprised, like there was a conversation in one of the SSP groups talking about children and if they had children in the SSP. And just like the quality of information that at least that I had compared to other people, you know, I mean, people don't remember a lot. And as much as I would like for people to remember more, for one thing, I find that SSP people are very hard to connect with. Most people are going about living their lives, really trying to survive. And that a lot of times, if you do go through the process of the quote unquote bliss creation, you're kind of screwed, because I do believe that you keep getting taken. At least that has been my experience. In fact, I think that what I'm dealing with now, I thought I was sick, but I do think I keep getting poisoned. I think that they keep injecting drugs in me. And it's something I've come to recognize over time now, but there is a definite symptoms that I experience on a regular basis where my body is metabolizing. And thankfully, because I have been elevating myself over the past several years, I can now see the pattern. Whereas before, like, you know, 10 years ago, I was just basically screwed. So, but I mean, for me, I have been, I've been taking a lot, you guys. I mean, I have been doing a lot to try and call back memories, because for different reasons, but I have been able to come up with a lot of memories. And it's just, the process is very traumatic. And so as you do remember more and more and more, you know, you, like I said, you have to keep getting good and better at reclaiming yourself and finding those things that you love, and doing those things, even small and simple things But I can tell you that most SSP people, they do want to understand. There's like 3 things, maybe there's 4, but they do want to understand why. They do want to heal. They do want more memories, and they want to, quote unquote, you know, nullify these contracts. At least they want to understand the nature of the contract. And part of me doesn't quite believe that the contracts can be completely severed. And that's just through my own personal experience. I think that a lot of this quote unquote idea of authorization and agreement of contract is just partly by being here on Earth. That's something I've already agreed to experience. And so, but, you know, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts on all of these things that, you know, we're discussing. But in general, SSP people, like they're just surviving, and they don't have a lot of time, and they're just kind of lost, and I think most people are just kind of doing their own thing. And so I don't know, you know, I mean, I desire to be of service to SSP vets, very much so. But on that same token, I just don't, you know, I really don't know how to help them.
But Tia, I
That's
think
largely because they're not accessible. I'm sorry, go ahead. So
no, but I just wanted to say how good a job you've done at identifying the issue, which essentially is long-term memory. Actually, you know, it occurred to me strongly as you were speaking that one of the ways that what's called the fallen Nephilim, the fallen ones, define what it is to fall is specifically loss of long-term memory. And the Draco race themselves admit that's one of their racial problems is loss of long-term memory. And incidentally, if you want to heal post-traumatic stress syndrome, PTSD, step 1 is always restore the continuity of memory where you disconnected at the moment of maximum pain.
right.